There was a time, maybe not too long ago, when I couldn't understand why everything around me seemed to just stop. You know those moments when life feels like it's pressing pause on you while the rest of the world keeps spinning? I remember waking up one morning and realizing I hadn't had a real conversation in days. My phone was silent, my inbox empty, even my thoughts felt distant, like I was listening to them underwater. The strangest part, it wasn't because something dramatic had happened. No breakups, no job loss, no major crisis. Just silence, just space. At first, I thought something was wrong with me. I tried to fill the void, watched pointless videos, scrolled endlessly, reached out to people just to hear a ping back. But the more I reached out, the more I felt like I was shouting into a canyon. Eventually, I stopped trying. I let the silence in. And man, it was deafening. No distractions, no noise, no one to reflect me back to myself. Just me. And the unbearable stillness. I started to ask myself those questions you only ask when you're completely alone. Not the surface level stuff like, what should I eat today, or should I call my mom? No, I mean the ones that hit deeper, like a whisper from someplace old and sacred. Who am I if no one's watching? What do I actually believe in when no one's there to validate me? It was weird. I felt like I'd been living someone else's life, wearing a version of myself that I'd pieced together from expectations, fears, and performances. Without anyone around, all of that started to fall apart. I won't lie. It scared me. There's this myth we all grow up with, that being alone means something's broken, that if you're not surrounded by people, success, or distractions, then you must be failing. But slowly, and I mean really slowly, I started to realize that maybe this silence was a gift. Not a punishment, not a curse, not a mistake, a gift. Like the universe had carefully carved out a space for me, away from the noise so I could finally hear my own soul speak. And it did speak. Soft at first, then louder. I'd sit for hours just thinking, or walking aimlessly with no destination. I remembered things I hadn't thought of in years, moments when I felt joy without reason, or pain I'd buried so deep I didn't even know it was still there. I saw my patterns more clearly, how I'd been chasing validation like it was oxygen, how I'd contorted myself just to be liked, just to belong. That hurt to see, honestly. It hurt to admit that I didn't really know who I was beneath all that performance. But there was also something freeing in that honesty, like for the first time I could breathe, not shallow, anxious breaths, but deep, grounding ones. I wasn't performing anymore, I wasn't pretending, there was no one to impress. Just me, stripped down to the rawest version of myself. And weirdly, that person wasn't so bad. Lonely? Yeah. Confused? Definitely. But there was a quiet strength there, too, something that didn't depend on applause or approval, just presence. I started writing again. Not for anyone else, just for me. Journaling, scribbling nonsense, pouring thoughts onto the page without caring if they made sense. I let myself be messy and real and human. And in that process, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. Not to a group or a job or an identity, but to myself. Like I was slowly coming home to a person I'd forgotten I was. Maybe the universe knew I needed this pause. Maybe it got tired of watching me run in circles, performing roles I didn't even like, clinging to connections that only mirrored my fears. Maybe it stepped in and said, "Enough, it's time to go within." And maybe, just maybe, this silence, this space, this strange and sacred loneliness was exactly the medicine I needed. I'm not out of the woods yet, but I'm no longer afraid of the quiet. I've come to respect it, even crave it sometimes, because in that silence, I'm starting to hear myself again. And that voice, my real voice, feels like something worth listening to. There was a moment somewhere in that long stretch of quiet when I felt myself slipping under, not dramatically. It was more like a slow sinking, like being pulled by something heavy you didn't even know you were carrying. I'd wake up, sit in the same chair, look out the same window, and feel like the world was happening on the other side of a thick glass wall. I wasn't in pain exactly, more like suspended in a kind of numb fog. I didn't recognize myself anymore, and that was terrifying. That's when the darker thoughts began to whisper, not the kind that scream or threaten, but the ones that erode you from the inside, the subtle ones. You're wasting time. No one's thinking about you. You should be doing more. Those voices didn't come from nowhere. They were echoes of things I'd heard, from others, sure, but mostly from myself. Over the years, I'd built up this image of who I was supposed to be. Productive, useful, needed. Without that, who was I? The silence began to press harder, and for the first time, I didn't just hear the quiet. I heard what it was hiding. All the grief I hadn't dealt with, the anger I'd suppressed, the fear I pretended wasn't there, and deeper still, a kind of sorrow, not about anything specific, but about everything. A sadness that had no words, just weight. It was like I had been running from myself for so long, and now I'd finally caught up and didn't know what to say. I cried one night, harder than I had in years, not because of any one thing. It was like every disappointment, every ignored wound, every silenced feeling, they all rose up at once and demanded to be felt, and I let them. I didn't try to fix it or rationalize it. I just sat there, holding myself in the dark, and let the wave crash over me. And strangely, something broke open. Not in a painful way, more like a dam finally giving way after years of pressure. After the tears, there was a strange calm. Not happiness, not relief, just a kind of stillness I hadn't known before, like I'd finally told the truth, at least to myself. That night changed something. I realized that this wasn't just about being alone. It was about being with myself, fully. No filters, no escapes, no masks. I began to notice how often I'd avoided this kind of intimacy with my own soul, how I'd filled every gap with noise, every ache with distraction. And now that all of that was stripped away, I had nothing left but the truth. And as painful as it was, it also felt like a kind of freedom. I started to sit with the discomfort instead of running from it. I stopped labeling feelings as good or bad. They were just signals, information, parts of me I hadn't been listening to. And the more I listened, the more I realized how loud the silence actually was. It had always been speaking. I'd just been too busy, too afraid, too tired to hear it. There's a strange kind of dignity in facing yourself, raw and unedited. You begin to see the contours of your shadow, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that makes you whole. The fears, the regrets, the flaws, they weren't enemies. They were lost parts of me, waiting to be acknowledged. I started walking again. Not with a goal or a route, just walking, feeling the ground under my feet, the wind against my skin. And in those small moments, those ordinary, quiet moments, I started to feel a pulse again, a connection, not to the world, not yet, but to something deeper, to myself. I can't say I felt better immediately. This wasn't a movie montage where everything clicks into place. It was slow, uneven, often messy, but there was movement. I was no longer sinking. I was swimming, maybe badly, maybe clumsily, but swimming nonetheless. And that mattered. That meant something, because it meant I hadn't given up. It meant I was still here, still showing up for myself, even when no one else could see it, even when it felt like no one cared. Looking back, I think that was the beginning of healing. Not fixing, not solving, just being with what was real and letting that be enough. It took me a while to realize that healing wasn't going to look like I thought it would. I had this old story in my head, probably built from books, movies, or those polished quotes people post online, that healing meant feeling better, being lighter, finally having answers. But what I was going through didn't feel like that. It felt more like being emptied out, like being taken apart piece by piece until only the most honest parts of me were left behind. There was no grand revelation, no light shining through the clouds, just small shifts, subtle moments where something inside me softened. I remember one afternoon. It was nothing special, just a breeze coming through the window and the way the sunlight hit the wall. And I felt it. This stillness, this okayness. For a second, I wasn't fighting. I wasn't searching. I was just there, breathing. And that moment, as fleeting as it was, felt like a miracle. I started paying attention to those tiny moments, the way I felt after writing something real in my journal, the calm that came after crying without holding back, the way my body relaxed after a long walk where I didn't try to solve anything, just let my feet move. Those weren't the loud moments of transformation. They were quiet, but they were real. They were mine. And in those moments, I began to see that I was changing, not in a way you could photograph or measure, but in a deeper way. I was no longer reaching outside myself for worth or identity. I was beginning to return to myself. Slowly, tenderly, I began to recognize the false stories I had lived by for so long. Stories like, you have to be needed to be valuable, or if you're not productive, you're wasting your life. Those beliefs had guided me for years, and they had kept me in cycles of burnout, self-neglect, and quiet despair. But now, with all the noise gone, I could see them for what they were, echoes of fear, echoes of a world that rewards performance more than presence. And maybe that's why the silence had come. Maybe the universe, or life, or whatever you want to call it, knew I wouldn't stop unless everything was stripped away. Maybe it knew that I needed to sit in the wreckage for a while so I could see what was actually worth rebuilding, because that's what it started to feel like, not recovery, not repair, but rebuilding from the ground up, from the inside out. I started asking myself real questions. What do I value truly? What kind of life feels honest to me? Not ideal, not impressive, but honest? What kind of relationships nourish me? What do I want to give, and what do I need to receive? And the biggest question, can I love myself not for who I could be someday, but for who I am, right here, in this imperfect, unfinished state? Some days the answer was yes. Other days, not yet. But even asking the question felt like a form of love. There's a kind of strength that comes from sitting in your own silence, a strength that doesn't depend on applause or validation, a strength that whispers, I'm still here, even when everything else is uncertain. And that strength, I realized, was mine. It had always been there, buried under layers of noise and roles and expectations. I just hadn't known how to listen. Now I was listening. I wasn't trying to be better anymore. I was trying to be real, to be whole. And in that intention, something inside me had begun to heal, not by fixing, but by finally being seen. There's something sacred about the space that opens up once you stop trying to be who you think you're supposed to be. It doesn't happen all at once. It's slow. At first, it feels like a loss, like you're letting go of some identity you've clung to for so long that it became fused with your skin. But eventually, when the fear softens, you start to realize what's left beneath it all, the raw, unfinished, honest version of you. And strangely, that person starts to feel like home. The more I sat with myself, the more I began to feel like I was being reintroduced to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Not just who I was as a kid, though there were glimpses of that too, but something deeper, a core self, the part of me that had never needed to prove anything, that wasn't shaped by shame or performance. It had always been there, just buried under years of noise and conditioning. And now, with all the distractions gone, it had room to breathe again. I started noticing how much I used to resist just being. There was always a sense that I needed to be working towards something, fixing something, earning something. Even rest had to be productive, like it needed to serve a purpose or justify itself. But now, in the quiet, I began to see rest for what it really was, a return, not a pause from life, but life itself. A chance to be present without agenda. I think one of the most surprising things was how peaceful nothingness could feel. Not the nihilistic kind of nothing, not emptiness in a hollow way, but spaciousness, like all the air I'd been gasping for was finally filling my lungs. There was no pressure to perform, no obligation to impress, just the quiet hum of existence. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like that was enough. I started to feel more connected to things in a way that didn't need words. A cup of tea in the morning, the sound of the wind through the trees, watching the light change as the day moved on. It was like I'd slowed down enough to notice life's subtleties, and they were so alive, so full of quiet meaning. It reminded me that I didn't need big answers or grand purpose to feel at peace. Sometimes meaning is found in presence, in noticing, in being, and that presence started to reflect inward too. I began treating myself with more softness. When a painful memory surfaced, I didn't shove it down. I let it sit beside me. When I made a mistake, I didn't spiral into shame. I reminded myself, growth doesn't mean perfection. It means honesty. It means being willing to see yourself clearly and still choose compassion. I realized I'd spent so much of my life trying to earn love, not just from others, but from myself. Like I had to hit a certain benchmark before I was worthy of kindness. But now, without anyone watching, I had no choice but to learn how to love myself in the rawest form, and not the self-help book version of self-love. I mean the quiet, unglamorous kind. The kind that shows up when you're crying on the floor, or forgetting to eat, or doubting everything. The kind that whispers, "You're allowed to be human. I'm still here with you." That was the turning point, I think, when I stopped trying to escape the discomfort and started honoring it. When I began to see solitude not as isolation, but as intimacy, the deepest kind. The kind that lets you sit with your pain, your joy, your longing, and not flinch. The kind that doesn't need fixing, just witnessing. It wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about coming back to someone ancient, someone true. And every day I chose to stay present with myself, I felt that connection deepen, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tree growing roots you can't see, quiet, strong, and unshakable. This was my quiet revolution. Not the kind anyone else could see, but I could feel it, in the stillness, in the softness, in the sense that, finally, I was no longer running from myself. I was walking with myself, and for the first time, that felt like enough. There's this part of the journey that no one really prepares you for, the resistance, not from others, but from yourself. You've already made peace with the silence, started hearing your inner voice, even begun nurturing that quiet relationship with who you are underneath it all. But then something unexpected shows up. The part of you that's scared to change. The one that clings to the familiar pain because at least it's predictable. I didn't see it coming at first. I thought I was past the hardest part. But one morning I woke up with this aching desire to go back, to fill the space again, to distract, to busy myself, to do anything but sit with the truth I'd worked so hard to uncover. It wasn't because I stopped believing in the process. It was because being real was exhausting. It stripped me down. And sometimes I missed the comfort of the illusion, even if it had been slowly killing me. I'd catch myself thinking maybe I was overreacting, Maybe it's fine to live on autopilot. Maybe all this soul-searching is just making things harder. That voice in my head, the old voice, was seductive. It made a case for safety, for routine, for surface-level comfort. And for a moment, I believed it. I stopped journaling. I avoided the hard questions. I filled my days with noise again, just to drown out the stillness I had once craved. But here's the thing. Once you've tasted your own truth, you can't unknow it. It haunts you in the best way. It calls to you in the quiet moments between distractions. And no matter how far you try to run, it waits for you with patience that feels almost holy. That's what started to happen. I'd be scrolling mindlessly and suddenly feel this pang in my chest. Not guilt, not shame, but longing. A gentle tug reminding me, you were getting close, don't stop now. I realized then that resistance wasn't failure. It was part of the process. It was my old self, scared to die. And of course it was. That version of me had gotten me through so much. Even if it was built on avoidance and masks, it had protected me when I didn't know better. So instead of fighting it, I began to listen. I asked that part of me, what are you afraid of? And slowly it started to answer. It was afraid of not being loved without performing. Afraid of being abandoned if I changed too much. Afraid of disappearing into irrelevance. These fears weren't irrational. They were born from real wounds, real memories, and they deserved to be heard, not silenced. So I sat with the resistance like I had sat with the silence. I didn't judge it. I didn't try to push it away. I just let it exist. And in that space, something beautiful happened. It started to soften. The more I honored it, the less power it had over me. It was like the part of me that had once screamed, "Don't change," was now whispering, "Please be gentle." That's when I understood what surrender really meant. It wasn't about giving up. It was about letting go of the idea that healing had to look a certain way, that I had to be perfect at this. That transformation was linear. It wasn't. It was messy, inconsistent, and full of detours. And that was okay. The resistance became a teacher. It showed me where I was still holding on to stories that no longer served me. It revealed the corners of my heart I hadn't yet touched with compassion. And it reminded me that healing isn't just about moving forward. Sometimes it's about turning back, not to retreat, but to carry the forgotten parts of you along for the journey. I started saying things to myself that I never had before. Things like, it's okay to be scared. You don't have to get it all right. You're allowed to take your time. And slowly, I noticed I was becoming someone I didn't just tolerate, but someone I actually trusted. There's something powerful about choosing yourself, even when the old you is begging you not to. It's an act of quiet rebellion, a declaration that says, I love you, but I won't stay here. That's what I was learning. That resistance doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're standing on the threshold of becoming. And all you have to do is keep walking. Even if it's slow, even if it's messy, even if you're afraid, especially then. There's a strange kind of darkness that comes just before something breaks open. I don't mean external chaos, though that can happen too. I'm talking about the inner kind. That quiet, suffocating heaviness that shows up after you've done the work, faced your shadow, pushed through resistance, and yet still feel like you're standing in the middle of nowhere. That's where I found myself. It wasn't hopelessness in the dramatic sense. It was more like a subtle despair, like I had traveled so far inward, peeled back so many layers, only to find silence again. But this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was empty. There were days I questioned everything. What was the point of all this effort? What was I even becoming? I felt like I was floating between two selves, the one I had outgrown and the one I hadn't yet stepped into, and that space in between. That space was agony. I remember sitting at the edge of my bed one night, staring into the dark and thinking, I don't know who I am anymore. And I didn't. All my old roles were gone. The performative identities, the busy distractions, the need to prove, all dissolved. But what replaced them hadn't fully formed. I was in the in-between, and it felt like free-falling. But here's the thing, that darkness, that in-between, it had a purpose, because it was in that raw, vulnerable space that something new started to emerge. Not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. I began to feel things I hadn't felt in a long time. Not the old anxieties or the self-criticisms, but flickers of possibility. I started to sense that maybe this emptiness wasn't a void after all. Maybe it was fertile ground, and from that place I began to rebuild, not from fear, not from habit, but from choice. I asked myself, what if I don't rush to fill this space? What if I let it speak to me instead? So I did. I stopped trying to fix the discomfort. I let myself be in it. I let it wash over me, and slowly I saw it for what it really was. Grief. Not just for things I'd lost, but for the parts of me I had to let go of. The identities that once protected me. The beliefs that kept me safe, but small. The life I thought I wanted that I now knew would never be enough. Grief is a strange kind of love, you know? It means you cared. It means you lived. And it means something is transforming. So I gave myself permission to mourn, not because I was broken, but because I was shedding. I cried for the old me, the scared me, the version that tried so hard to belong. I cried for all the years I spent chasing worth outside myself. And when the tears dried, something surprising was left behind. Stillness, yes, but this time with a sense of readiness. Not a readiness to conquer or prove, but a readiness to live, honestly, fully, gently. It's easy to romanticize growth when you're on the other side of it. But when you're in the thick of it, it feels like unraveling. And yet, that unraveling is sacred, because it clears space for truth, for clarity, for selfhood that isn't borrowed or filtered, but real. So no, that darkness wasn't the end. It was the cocoon, the last exhale before the new breath begins. And I think deep down, I knew that. I just had to stay long enough to see the light return, not outside of me, but from within. It didn't happen in a flash like some grand revelation. It was quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. But one day I woke up and the weight wasn't as heavy. My breath felt deeper. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. And in that space, I began to feel something I hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the desperate grasp for things to be back to normal. This was different. This was a grounded, steady, almost sacred sense that something within me had shifted, that I had changed. And not in a way that made me someone new, but someone more me than I'd ever been. There was no finish line, no perfect closure, but I could feel it in the way I moved through my days. I laughed more freely, not because everything was fine, but because I wasn't trying to hold it all together anymore. I cried more easily too, and not out of despair, but from being deeply touched by something real. I had become more porous, more open. Life could get in now, and I could finally meet it, not from fear, but from presence. And maybe that's what rebirth really is. Not starting over, not becoming better, but allowing the old to fall away so that what's always been true can finally emerge. I had peeled off so many layers of expectation, of performance, of self-rejection, and underneath it all I found someone I recognized, someone I could love. Not because she had everything figured out, but because she had stopped pretending. There was such power in that, to look in the mirror and say, I know you, and I'm not leaving. And it wasn't just about me anymore. This transformation, this quiet revolution, started to ripple outward. The way I spoke to others changed. I didn't need to fix them or impress them. I could just be with them, really be. I could hold space for their pain without making it about me. I could celebrate their joy without comparing it to mine. I could love without possession and be alone without abandonment, because I was no longer looking for someone to complete me. I had come home to myself. That's the thing they don't tell you about healing. It doesn't always make life easier, but it makes it more real. And in that realness, there's beauty, there's connection, there's freedom. I still have hard days. I still fall into old patterns sometimes. But now I catch myself with kindness. I don't spiral the way I used to. I return faster. I forgive more easily. I listen more deeply. And I rest, not out of exhaustion, but as a way to honor my humanity. This journey taught me that the darkest places in us aren't there to destroy us. They're there to be understood, to be integrated, to be loved back into wholeness. And when we stop running, when we stay, truly stay with ourselves through the storm, we emerge not as someone new, but as someone honest, someone free. That's who I am now, not perfect, not fixed, but alive, rooted, awake, and I wouldn't trade this version of myself for anything.